and welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast. I'm Flora Lockridge, Creative Director and host of this new interview series. I'm here with my colleague and Director of Ideal Spaces, Ulrich Gehmann.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for listening today.
So at Ideal Spaces, we've been doing lots of research on how communities interact with the spaces around them. We're interested in ways we can improve our cities and landscapes to maximise on their positive qualities and essentially improve people's quality of life. There are a great number of issues in the world today. We're only just slowly recovering from a global pandemic. The climate crisis continues to present a huge threat to the future of humanity. These problems really do force us to think more broadly and deeply about finding sustainable solutions that will help communities manage in the long term. With all that in mind, we're delighted to welcome Greg Delaune onto the podcast today. Greg's an expert in green, clean and smart cities and regenerative marine infrastructure. He's going to share with us steps we can all take to making the world a more sustainable place, and help us unpack some of those buzzwords such as resilience, regeneration, and sustainability that we hear so often when people talk about the climate crisis. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Greg, you've got over 15 years of experience in economics, urban design, planning, policy, and management. And you're also the co-founder of two organisations, the Urban Innovation Exchange and Deep Blue Institute. Both of these organisations aim to change how communities engage with climate change and how they can help the environment more broadly. So just to kickstart our conversation today, I wondered if you could tell me at what stage of your life did you realise that firstly, there are some real problems with how people are managing the aquatic and land-based environments around them? And what approach are you now taking to help communities overcome some of these issues?
Yeah, great. Well, my background is architecture and then landscape architecture and urban design, and then eventually getting into economic development. So I often say that I come from a design background that just kept on getting larger and larger scale. And I got to the point where I was working for a university in Italy, the University of Ferrara, co-founding and teaching a master's program in international sustainable economic development. We were doing in the field projects, balancing the ideas of sustainable economic development between environmental factors, economic factors, and then sociocultural factors, because we felt like that sort of three-legged stool is really what made a project truly sustainable. And particularly, we worked on a lot of UNESCO sites. So we got to do a fascinating project on Easter Island where we were looking at carrying capacity. We were looking at the Coral Coast in Alagoas in Brazil. We did some work in Curitiba, which is famous for its sustainability policies, and also at the Guaracaçaba area, which is a beautiful, pristine bay to the east of Curitiba in Brazil. So in each case, we were bringing together a lot of oftentimes architects, but a mix of architects and engineers and environmental scientists, and looking at how we could balance these sociocultural resources of local music and food and festivals, but then local economic activities that often were subsistence activities like fishing and farming, and then economic resources and tools, particularly in the context of globalization. So in many of these areas, they were suffering from the effects of globalization, maybe with major petrochemical activities or with factories coming in and replacing traditional activities that were based on local artisans, et cetera. So we were trying to, again, balance these different aspects so that people could live, thrive, and survive while not losing those cultural resources. So fundamentally, my work that I have been doing since I've been back in the United States for about 10 years now, based mostly out of the Bay Area, was first with the Urban Innovation Exchange. So we were focused on public-private partnerships for green cities and smart cities, and working with cities, mostly in California, but in also other parts of the country and the world, to look at how cities, how municipal governments could incorporate innovative ideas and create ecosystems that supported innovative ideas and entrepreneurs that were bringing new technology, new ideas to the city through the implementation or the use of a chief innovation officer for the municipality. So after doing that work for a number of years with the Urban Innovation Exchange, and because of that work, I was asked to join the Seasteading Institute because they had been asked to come to French Polynesia to present to the president and his cabinet the possibility of building a floating city, a prototype floating city for French Polynesia, which was particularly relevant because French Polynesia is one of the countries that is most impacted by sea level rise and is facing the prospect of losing much of their ocean territory, which is determined by the areas of land that are, so to speak, above sea level, the islands. So they were looking at how they, even though the Polynesian people and island nations have the least to do with climate change, that they wanted to be one of the leaders in developing the new technology. So we went there, and I got involved with the seasteading movement, and particularly with the idea of regenerative marine infrastructure and how this could be similar to my previous work, something that both activated the local economy, but then also preserved local culture. And as a result of that, I started to think about my own background and where this work might be most relevant. And because I'm from New Orleans in Louisiana, and I learned that southern Louisiana and the state of Louisiana was losing a football field of land every hour and a half, and was facing the prospect of losing something like 2,000 to 3,000 square miles of land in the next 50 years. And the communities on the front line of the Bayou there are the ones most affected. So essentially, the Deep Blue Institute was formed to bring that experience and knowledge back to Louisiana to try to use that three-legged stool of sociocultural, economic, and environmental sustainability to help save these communities and to create and promote Louisiana as a regional laboratory and location where these regenerative marine infrastructure technologies and blue economy models can take root and hopefully thrive and retool what is otherwise an economy that's very focused on tourism and petrochemical. So that's where we're really focused right now and starting to get some traction down here in Louisiana.
Could you outline what is the essence of a blue economy in the case of the New Orleans region, considering the cultural aspect in particular?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I talk about it is really anything that has an impact or touches on the aquatic environment. So this could be something that has to do with more efficient fuels for transportation, for shipping, for recreational boating, etc. It could be design of boats, design of floating infrastructure, so regenerative marine infrastructure. Certainly related to aquaculture and mariculture. So whether it's freshwater or saltwater environments, how are we scaling and implementing new models for growing algae in combination with shellfish and fish farming in ways that, again, produce a net positive impact. So in the case of fish farming, these could be these new technologies for drift cages. So think of huge geodesic balls that are drifting on the currents and therefore distributing the fish waste that is otherwise a problem with fish farming. Certainly water quality restoration, habitat restoration, all these things become part of activities that in some cases are part of adaptation and mitigation projects for slowing or reversing the loss of land in the Delta, but then also aquaculture, mariculture programs that can offer opportunities to people in the bayou to get involved in these new technologies for ocean farming, but then changes to how people are doing fishing, doing shrimping, etc. Energy on the water. So the shift away from new oil drilling in the Gulf and towards offshore wind programs that are now expanding on the Gulf, and then how that impacts the water quality and the habitat quality for the seafood industry and the tourism industry and the sport fishing industry, et cetera, is so important on that water quality, on that habitat quality. So all of these things are not verticals that are unrelated, but they're completely interrelated industries that Louisiana and regions of the world, particularly delta regions and low-lying coastal regions, their industries, their livelihoods, their where they live, their resilience to storm surges and hurricane damage, wind damage, et cetera, flooding, et cetera. All of these things are completely interlinked. And that's why it's such a critical, important region as a model for the blue economy, because it's an interlinked and, again, regenerative approach, a systems approach, where the different individual systems are feeding into and supporting an overall system that supports this three-legged stool, again, of sustainable economic, environmental, and sociocultural components of these communities along the coast.
Absolutely, because those sociocultural and economic systems are really deeply rooted in communities, and it's impossible really to separate them out from a community's treatment of environmental and ecological systems. You mentioned before that regenerative technologies are starting to get some traction in Louisiana, which is really great to hear. I wondered how communities tend to respond when they're first approached with those new ideas, technologies, and ways of doing things. Do people tend to be quite hesitant about making those changes?
Well, the state of Louisiana has for decades, probably going on a century now, has been very dependent upon the petrochemical industry. So there is some hesitancy in some respects because it's the only thing a lot of people have ever known. But the approach that I've worked with the Urban Innovation Exchange and now with Deep Blue Institute is really a sort of combined approach where, sure, we're talking about what some of the problems are with continuing with our current behavior and trends with fossil fuels, et cetera, but really leading with a carrot rather than a stick and presenting opportunities and explaining how opportunities in the blue economy, which is already a $3.8 billion sector globally and is expected to reach 6.5 million in the next 3 to 4 years, that explaining that this is really the future, this is where the opportunities are, and that the workforce of the petroleum industry, which is made up of welders, pipe fitters, heavy machinery builders and operators, marine infrastructures builders and maintainers, these are all skill sets that can be relatively easily retooled to be working on these very interesting and complex and lucrative blue technologies that the rest of the world is going to be needing in the coming decades. So we try to lead with sort of the opportunities, and then in New Orleans in particular, but in Louisiana, the cultural preservation is something that people are keenly aware of. So we're trying to lead with these opportunities to explain how creative culture here can participate in these new industrial trends. And this can be a real bright future rather than otherwise. There's not a lot of ideas on the table for how to navigate and come out of COVID and navigate a continued reduction in petroleum fossil fuel extraction for the economy.
Yeah, this would be also my question, Greg. I would be very interested in how to achieve the shift from the existing economy towards the future envisaged new form of economy. Also, how to make it realistically in terms of policies to be implemented and for making this shift possible at all.
Yeah, well, some of this is already happening. So it's been happening for the last few years, but particularly with the new federal administration, I think some of the barriers are being removed for large-scale environmental projects and funding to try to save Southern Louisiana. So there's $50 billion in projects and initiatives that have started to get underway that have to do with potentially opening up parts of the levee on the Mississippi and essentially rerouting the sediment cycle of the Mississippi so as to restore the sediment cycle and try to mitigate some of the land loss that's happening from the combination of sea level rise, increased storm activity, which is producing king tides and storm surges, which is exacerbating the loss of land. One of the specific projects that Deep Blue Institute is working with a local organization called Comey Resources has to do with wastewater assimilation wetlands. So there is a proof of concept project which has been in place in the city of Mandeville on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain here in New Orleans, and that has been functioning for going on 10 years. And that is essentially using municipal sewage, and after a primary and secondary treatment, is being distributed out into the marshland, into the bayous, to fertilize and grow biomass. So that proof of concept is very important because one of the things that exacerbated the damage to New Orleans during Katrina was the fact that the eastern wetland, just to the east of New Orleans, was in such poor health and had lost so many cypress trees and so much biomass that it was unable to provide a buffer for the winds and the surges that came with Katrina. So this wastewater assimilation wetland and its ability to fertilize and grow biomass in the marshlands that protect the city of Louisiana, and also potentially be used to fertilize the barrier islands, which are a critical component of this bulwark of protections for Louisiana coast, is a real critical first pass technology that we're working on. Some of the projects in that 50 billion that is being implemented now include the engineering, the construction of coastal barrier islands, but there's not really a long-term plan for how to maintain those in the face of sea level rise and these storm surges. So the ability to implement these technologies for using wastewater assimilation as a fertilizing tool is something that we're now in a position to start to scale and bring out into the communities. That is a very concrete and measurable positive impact that we can bring in a relatively short amount of time. And then there's other activities like we're working with the Clean Tech Open to try to recruit startup companies in Louisiana and to bring them to Louisiana that are focused on clean technologies and blue technologies. And that would fall in the realm of talent attraction and talent development. So what we're trying to do here is as quickly as possible to demonstrate and label and grow the story, tell the story, develop the story of what positive things are happening and how those things can grow and help launch this blue economy in Louisiana so that it can really be a significant factor in the regional economy. And this is something that we point to France, that France is already completely committed to the blue economy and investing a lot there. And as I said before, this is a multi-billion-dollar sector that Louisiana is in a position to become a leader rather than be in a position where they're having to purchase or contract for these very expensive and complex technologies.
And how long do you think it would take to scale up these kind of solutions that you've been pioneering in Louisiana?
Well, again, what we want to do, because this is very important in sort of the political context and the immediate economic context, is to have some short-range victories.
Yeah.
So with the Clean Tech Open, if we can be graduating a cohort of even 5 to 10 clean technology companies by the end of the year, if we can attach to that a blue technology prize of some kind and grow that story, then that's an immediate activity. The wastewater assimilation projects, those obviously have a longer timeline, but I think even those are things that the projects could get going within a matter of months. The real construction and implementation is probably in the 1 to 3 year range. But there's certainly an ability to have multiple projects going on. And of course, we want to be very open source about all this. So the Deep Blue Institute is fundamentally, we want to be propagating all these sorts of activities that we're doing and sharing knowledge and activating and empowering the great work that's already happening here. So with that sort of approach, I think that this story that we're building in the blue economy getting noticed here could happen in a matter of, I would say, certainly 2 to 5 years. And then the impacts of these large projects, obviously that's a little bit longer scale, maybe 5 to 10 years. But for myself as a long range planner, we need to be thinking at least 10, 20, 30, 50 years out, because the real impacts and the real losses, as I said before, of 2,500 square miles or more that will be lost in Louisiana's coastal areas, and that's under a medium scenario. That's looking at a 50-year range. So there's got to be a combination of time ranges, and depending on who we're working with, we're going to emphasize those because, as we know, politicians are thinking about months or a year or two, and we need to work with them as well to see how their communities can benefit from the mix of these strategies.
This is very interesting also with regard to the needed long-term range of all these considerations. In this context, I have the question based on my own experiences. What are the major resistances now the entire project is confronted with, and how to overcome these resistances?
Well, I don't have to tell our listeners and you that we live in a very dynamic political period right now. So the political forces at play in the United States have a tendency to make, whether it's something as logical as wearing a mask to prevent the spread of COVID, to protecting wetlands and restoring habitats and improving water quality, that those things have a tendency to get politicized. So the petroleum industry in Louisiana is, as I said, the incumbent industry. It has a lot of influence over the politics, the politicians, economic subsidies, and investment. The reality is that there are no Fortune 500 companies headquartered in New Orleans or in Louisiana. That most of the activity that happens in Louisiana, those companies are actually headquartered somewhere else. So the economic benefits of the extractive technologies and activities that happen in Louisiana, the benefits really go somewhere else. So all that's to say is that there is resistance to change in that respect. But on the other hand, the reality is that these large oil companies are no longer investing in Louisiana because of the growth of lawsuits and the environmental obstacles that are coming up with regard to protecting habitats and water quality. There's a general lack of new investment in Louisiana. So there is political pushback. There is just cultural pushback on what people are used to. These diversion projects will be very disruptive to some communities that are based on certain types of aquaculture, mariculture. If you're raising crawfish or you're raising shrimp or you're a shrimp boat captain, the diversions will change the balance of salinity and freshwater in the area. So that's going to cause some dislocation of people's industries and lives. So whatever we're doing at a regional scale and whatever policies we're bringing to bear and whatever supporting programs we're bringing, we need to help those communities, help those entrepreneurs, help those people to transition to literally the new landscape of the Bayou. This is a community engagement process. Everybody has to be informed, involved, and we need to build broad-based community support so that everybody understands that we can't continue the way things are. We have to change. We are all in this together, and we're going to build strategies and systems and programs that allow people to transition to these new jobs, these new industries, these new ways of life, as the changes in the environment and the changes in the industries and the economy start to come into effect.
Mm-hmm. What approach would you take to engaging members of the community? I would imagine as well it's to some extent generational, people's attitudes to change. I mean, do you target younger people who are just learning about this new way of life, I guess, as a priority, or do you target all members of the community? And if so, how do you go about that?
Yeah, the quick answer is all of those. So again, it's a community engagement process. Deep Blue Institute as an institution, as an organization, is really just getting started in Louisiana. So I don't pretend that we can sort of take any of this on by ourselves at all. We're trying to bring some new tools and new ideas, but fundamentally to activate and work with the great work that's already happening. So Louisiana, in southern Louisiana, as an area that is already experiencing some of this dislocation, as an area that has historically faced issues related to people of color and neighborhoods and members of the community that face issues and obstacles to getting access to education and to economic resources, et cetera. All that is part of this. But there are organizations already in place that are working with communities in the Bayou, that are creating education programs and working with K through 12 and university programs and entrepreneurs, et cetera. So really, we're just trying to support and inform and offer more of the focus on the blue economy. But specifically, we see opportunities for starting with K through 12 and going to these communities and engaging with the local politicians and local teachers and schools and imagining, let's activate these, let's say 8, 9, 10-year-olds to start to imagine and design what their floating city looks like, what their floating home looks like, and give them the vision and the tools and unleash their creativity so that when they get to high school and they move on to college, that these are not new ideas, these are established ideas. And none of this is particularly extraordinary or out of this world. These are ideas that, if we look at Amsterdam, the Dutch, the Netherlands have been building floating architecture, floating row houses, conference centers, all kinds of things for many, many years, decades. So this is not something that is space age or futuristic, but it's not necessarily a part of how people think here.
It's also an interesting point. And in these regards, allow me a provocative question. As regards the political and the socio-economic context and its relation to cultural issues, are recent form of capitalism and community building not enemies? Natural enemies?
Wow, that's a pretty open question, Ulrich, but I'll take a shot at it. I mean, to me, it's again, there are existing activities here. There's some folks that I've met with local housing authorities that are working with disadvantaged communities. New Orleans East is an area that has experienced a lot of poverty, is a predominantly African-American area. But I was surprised meeting one of the people that is the head of the housing authority there, that she had already been thinking about floating foundations and these sort of mitigating or adaptive technologies years ago. So to me, there are opportunities without necessarily challenging existing forms of market-driven economy and capitalism, et cetera. There are plenty of ways that we can demonstrate that these new technologies and the job opportunities and the workforce development opportunities that will come with them are all fundamentally consistent and can work in harmony with traditional models of economic development and capital investment, et cetera, et cetera. If there are more social democracy or other more community-oriented programs that come to play that are funded, et cetera, to me that can work well also. But I'm not particularly concerned about any conflict between these ideas of adapting to sea level rise and developing the blue economy here and any existing form of economic systems that are in place here.
As I said, it was deliberately a very provocative
question. Of course, I appreciate that. No, and it's an important topic.
Yeah. And I think also it's an important issue, because it's a big difference, for me at least, in my conception, if you are essentially based on a self-sustaining economy, which is in accordance with the local ecological conditions on the long term, or if you are based on an economy of growth as a capitalist system is. No?
Yeah, well, I think because of some of the structure of Louisiana and New Orleans, there's a lot of activities, and the economy has a tendency to be overly influenced by outside investment. So there's a term that people use a lot here, carpetbaggers. And fundamentally, it means people from other parts of the country, other parts of the world even, coming and benefiting and having an extractive approach to the Louisiana economy or the New Orleans economy. So at the state scale, the petroleum is a perfect example. If you've got a company that's based out of another state or another country that is extracting fossil fuel resources here and the profits are going somewhere else, that's a perfect example at that scale. But even at the creative scale here, people are very aware of the idea that the jazz music and blues, etc., or what is commonly referred to as BAM, Black American music, it comes from New Orleans. Is basically the source of that creative culture. But the benefits, the economic benefits and the music industry, et cetera, does not share those benefits with New Orleans and with the artists that are the source of that. So those are things that are a recurring cycle here. It's a bit of a banana republic cycle, if you will. Part of what Deep Blue Institute is looking at, and I think other great organizations in the region are looking at, how do we break that cycle, and how do we make the region more self-sufficient? How do we make a more circular economy here where we're doing local production and local people and local industry, local entrepreneurs are developing and benefiting from the cultural resources and natural resources that Louisiana has, and breaking the cycle of external investors and parties that are benefiting from Louisiana's resources and a local population not receiving those benefits.
Yeah, because it's ultimately that local community that drives the system. It feeds it and will hopefully then also see some benefits economically. I think it'd be really helpful to maybe unpack some of those words that we've been talking about throughout the interview so far for the benefit of our listeners, but also just to understand how these ideas of regenerative technologies have come about and developed, I suppose, over the years. When we speak about sustainability, resilience, regeneration, sustainability is about keeping something going without much change. Resilience then is more about defending from something, perhaps putting up barriers against a threat. And then regeneration is about bringing new life into the equation. I wondered how those words tie into the aims of Deep Blue Institute. Do you see a kind of narrative between them?
A resilient community, to me, is one that is resilient in terms of its ability to weather these economic changes or economic shocks to the system, but then also natural disasters and also longer range shifts to the environment, which obviously one of the examples is climate change. So, there's different aspects of resiliency. Sustainability to me is I don't want to say outdated, but it is being supplanted by the idea of regenerative. I think regenerative is the concept or idea that Deep Blue Institute is focused on. When we talk about regenerative marine infrastructure, we're talking about a relationship with our ocean environment and with our oceans that is fundamentally positive and points to the idea of a circular system or a circular economy. So whether it was our project in French Polynesia or what Deep Blue is doing in Louisiana, whatever work we're doing that is water quality restoration, habitat restoration, floating communities, aquaculture, mariculture, we want the impact on the aquatic environment to be net positive. Sustainable implies breaking even and moving forward in a net zero manner, whereas regenerative, we're looking at a combination of systems that produce a regenerative circular system that ultimately has a net positive impact in whatever aspect we're doing. And these are all things that are coming online and in conversations, et cetera, and certainly a key component of the blue economy. Because if we take our unsustainable relationship with land-based environments, whether it be agriculture or industry or urban development, and we simply move those to aquatic environments, then that's completely unsustainable. And we're just going to continue to harm and destroy our oceans rather than a new day dawning where whatever we're doing in relationship to the ocean and to the blue economy, again, we're fundamentally having a positive impact on the ocean and the aquatic environment.
It is very interesting as this interlinkage between different subsystems making up in their interaction a system as a whole, as like an overall shape developing towards a certain direction, or is hoped to develop in the long term towards a certain direction. This is a very interesting approach as a basic paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, these things are very interlinked, and particularly as it relates to technology. So technology in itself does not offer a solution. It's different technologies are simply tools. So the technology development is an important aspect, but for the most part, the ideas and the programs and the solution sets that we're proposing related to seasteading and floating cities and all those sorts of things, the technologies that we need to implement all of this are already in place. As the famous saying of the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. You know, if we look at the Dutch, they developed flood control technologies 400 or 500 years ago, and they've been selling those lucrative technologies and systems in other parts of the world for at least a couple hundred years, including in New York post-Sandy and in Louisiana post-Katrina. So the elements are all in place. The technologies are in place, even the policies and the programs that we can look at in France and the Netherlands and other parts of the world. All of these individual moving parts are proven, and we can point to them as successful ideas. The challenge and the reason why it takes years to shift regional behavior in a regional economy is to bring them all together and to adapt them and customize them for the local region and then the hyper-local communities that need to internalize and incorporate these new ideas and new technologies into what they're doing. So that's the challenge, and that's what we're trying to help accelerate. It's just a matter of changing the conversation and engaging with the community to empower them to see how all these things can fit together for a regenerative future for the entire region and the individual communities.
I think because people they tend at least to be very fixed in their ways. And I think with the environment, a lot of people have this attitude that, well, there's no point in me separating out my rubbish or saving water or energy, for example, because no one else does. So what influence am I really going to have if I get on board and do this too? But it's, of course, a chain effect.
Sure.
And if everyone took that same attitude, well, we'd be doomed. So what would you say, maybe as a final question, what would you say to those people who aren't convinced? How would you convince them that these issues, we do really need to care about them, and not tomorrow or next week, but now?
Yeah. I always say you talk different languages to different people. So when I sit down with a politician that is looking at getting reelected 18 months from now, or I sit down with a school teacher, I'm using a different language. If I'm talking to investors, I'm talking to angel investors or venture capitalists, I'm going to be talking about what the financial benefits are for investing in these technologies and how big the blue economy is and how they can benefit from that. So it really depends on who you're talking to and bringing it home with things that are important to them individually. And that includes if I'm talking to an 8-year-old child or a 10-year-old child who is seeing that their community is changing, and that's going on right now. So Plaquemine Parish, the high school there has essentially already been closed, and the high school students from that parish are now going to the St. Bernard Parish High School inland. So if you think about it, if you're that high school student, if you're that junior high student that was planning that your brother and your father and your grandfather had been to that high school, and you see your relatives moving away and you see industries disappearing, it's pretty easy to demonstrate that something's going on. So I think it always goes back to who is right in front of you, who you're talking to, and how can you communicate that we're all in this together, that there are opportunities, there are solution sets, and your individual behavior is important, just as all of these things are impacting you as an individual in the context of all the changes that are going on environmentally, economically, and socially.
Absolutely. And thank you again, Greg, for answering our questions today and for sharing more information with us about your current projects and the aims of Deep Blue Institute. It's just been so great to find out more about the blue economy and the role that community engagement plays, particularly with that close link you were talking about between culture, politics, and the environment. I really think there's something for us all to take away from today's discussion. The main thing being, though, that we can all contribute towards building a better and more sustainable future. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us. I'm going to pop the link to the Deep Blue Institute website in the show notes below, so everyone can read up on some of the things we've been talking about today.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, and that site is deepblue.institute. People can check it out, and and certainly reach out to us with any questions, or if you're interested in getting involved either locally or nationally. Again, one of the things that we're trying to bring is a national and international network with all of the work that we've done in different parts of the world. So to bring that to bear here, but this is really an international project, an international dialogue. Our partners are international, and we want to be exporting solution sets and supporting other communities around the world, particularly low-lying, at-risk coastal communities and island nations, as much as we want to be benefiting from and cooperating with the important solution sets that are coming from other parts of the world.
I have to thank you also, Greg. This was very, very interesting due to its concreteness, the entire approach and the facets you outlined. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ulrich. Thank you, Flora. And I'll look forward to staying in touch and continuing the conversation.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a comment and rate, review, and subscribe to the Ideal Spaces podcast. Thanks again for joining us, and see you next time.